So tonight it's our pleasure to welcome for you. Thank you for coming out on this wonderful, bright, sunny evening and braving the weather to see Hanna Meretoja, who is our honored guest tonight. Hanna is Professor of Comparative Literature and Director of CELMA, the Center for the Study of Storytelling, Experientiality, and Memory, and Vice Dean of the Faculty of the Humanities at the University of Turku, Finland. Hanna is the author of several books, including, is this your most recent one? The Ethics of Storytelling, Narrative Hermeneutics, History, and the Possible, which was published in 2018 by Oxford University Press. Other books that she's authored are The Narrative Turn in Fiction and Theory. She co-edited Values of Literature and co-edited Storytelling and Ethics, Literature, Visual Arts, and the Power of Narrative. I just want to say just a couple of words because Hanna is one of our close colleagues from the Department of Psychology here, including myself and Jens Brockmeyer, but also Sylvie Patron, and somebody that we've known for quite some time. She's really one of these scholars that is able to see across disciplines and has an extraordinary knowledge of not only literary criticism and narratology, but also philosophy and what's happening in narrative psychology. And one of the things that's really interesting about her new book that she'll speak to us about, but also probably about other things, is that it really lays out some really very creative ideas on how we can reimagine the past and think about the past and how it impacts our current life. And there's really something that's quite exciting about the work and something I think that should impact how it is that scholars, but also people, practitioners, apply and think about how is it that we deal with some of the contemporary problems that we have today. So a big warm welcome for Hanna. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and thank you so much, Brian, for those kind words. And this place, AUP, is really, really special for me. I have really fond memories of being here of the past years, and many of the discussions I've had with, for example, with Brian and Jens have also found their way to the book and so on. And great to see that so many of you were able to make it tonight. So, I will be talking about the ethical potential and dangers of narratives, partly based on the book and then also moving a bit beyond that. So one of the most pressing challenges that we face today is what it means to live in the current age of storytelling. Art is a world in which narrative is the fundamental way in which we are being influenced in virtually all areas of our lives, whether in politics or advertising or social media. Given that we are surrounded by narratives that influence us in both good and problematic ways, it's important to have conceptual tools to analyze and evaluate the ethical impact of different kinds of narrative practices. So, in my book, The Ethics of Storytelling, I try to develop this model for analyzing and evaluating narratives from an ethical perspective based on a hermeneutic approach to narrative. And in this talk, I will be firstly briefly outlining the kind of hermeneutic approach, what I mean by narrative hermeneutics, and then I will briefly present this model of hermeneutic narrative ethics that differentiates between 6 different dimensions of the ethical potential and dangers of narratives. And then in the final part of my paper, I will move beyond what I do in my book and discuss how my approach could be used in memory studies, and I also discuss it in relation to a recent book by a novelist called Jenny Erpenbeck, a novel called Geen Ging Gegangen, Go Went Gone in English. So reflection on interpretation and understanding. Narrative hermeneutics approaches narrative as a form and practice of interpretation. So it suggests that not only do we interpret narratives, so not only they are objects of our interpretation, but they themselves also engage in interpretation. So they are about interpreting human possibilities, human experiences, and human modes of being in the world. Interpretation here does not imply seeking some kind of hidden meaning that waits to be discovered in the depths of the object of interpretation. Instead, interpretation is an activity of sense-making, a mode of engagement and attachment, and a continuous process of reorientation. Philosophical hermeneutics stresses that such interpretative engagement does not only take place when we interpret texts, but it characterizes our mode of being in the world in general. Interpreting the world means engaging with it in such a way that it is rendered intelligible as a space of experience and action. Obviously, not all interpretation is narrative interpretation, but narrative interpretation plays a significant role in our interpretative engagements with the world. And it is also important for narrative hermeneutics that, as Paul Ricoeur puts it, no narrative is ethically neutral, so narratives are always ethically charged ways of interpreting the world. But first, also a couple of words on how I understand narrative, because there are so many different ways in different schools of narrative studies how to understand it. So in the book I propose conceptualizing narrative as an interpretative activity of cultural sense-making, in which experiences are presented to someone from a certain perspective or perspectives as part of a meaningful, connected account. It has a dialogical and a performative dimension, and it is relevant for understanding of human possibilities. So let me unpack this briefly. So first of all, narrative does not merely report what happened. It provides an interpretation of how the events or experiences are connected somehow, how they're related to one another, how they were experienced by someone in a particular situation. And this interpretation is not merely descriptive, it is also evaluative. The evaluative dimension is linked to the perspectival nature of narratives. That they are always told from someone's perspective and they convey someone's perspective on the world. That narratives have a dialogical dimension means that they always take shape in relation to culturally mediated narratives. We are always in kind of cultural webs of narratives. And the way narratives implicitly or explicitly comment and reinterpret other narratives is always also a process of renegotiating values that these narratives convey. My definition also emphasizes that narratives are relevant for the understanding of human possibilities. And this is a crucial way in which they are ethically charged. For example, the narrated world is a space of possibilities in which certain modes of action, thought, and experience are presented as possible for those agents who take up different subject positions within the narrative world. And literary narratives in particular explore human possibilities. And by doing so, they can open up new possibilities of action, thought, and experience and affect for us. Okay, so now I will go to this model of evaluating narratives with 6 evaluative continuums on which narratives can be placed. So we can, so I just briefly mentioned this here first. So we can analyze whether narratives expand or diminish our sense of the possible. Secondly, whether they cultivate or distort personal and cultural self-understanding. Third, whether they promote or impair our ability to understand experiences of others in their singularity. Fourth, whether they participate in building inclusive or exclusive narrative in-betweens. Whether they develop or impede our perspective awareness and perspective sensitivity, and whether they function as a form of ethical inquiry or dogmatism. So I will say a few words on all of these 6. And they are meant as a kind of heuristic tools. So it's not, here they sound like dichotomies, but I particularly emphasize that they are not like either or, they're more these continuums where you can place different kinds of narrative practices. And the idea is to emphasize that narratives in themselves are not good or bad for us, because some narrative scholars argue that narratives are always like, good for us or somehow dangerous, but I think it's always context dependent, and these are meant as ways of evaluating context sensitively different kinds of practices. Okay, so first sense of the possible. So it's, in my view, it's ethically crucial in ethically evaluating narratives whether they expand or diminish our sense of the possible. This idea is linked to the performative dimension of narratives, the fact that they produce realities and not merely represent events. They participate in constituting cultural and social reality. It means that they participate in creating intersubjective worlds which make certain modes of experience possible or likely and others impossible or unlikely or difficult. In developing this idea, I have drawn on Michel Foucault's work on the historical a priori, on Reinhard Koselleck's way of conceptualizing the historical world as a space of experience or Erfahrungsraum that is shaped by the sense-making practices of that world, and on Jacques Rancière's work on how art participates in redistributing the visible, thinkable, and sayable. So one's cultural world as a space of possibilities affects all aspects of one's embodied experience of being in the world, being and acting in the world with others. For example, it is difficult not just to express, but even to experience, for example, certain forms of sexuality if there are no words for those experiences. From this perspective, crucial to the ethical potential of narratives is not only the capacity to enrich the hermeneutic resources available for us to understand our own experiences and those of others, but also the way in which they can expand the possibilities that are open to us. And these are linked because it is difficult to experience things that we cannot name or express or recognize. So new vocabularies and modes of expression can also open up new possibilities of experience, thought, and affect and action. From this perspective, the ethical potential of narratives is linked precisely to their power to make something possible, to expand our sense of what we can experience, feel, and do. This sense of the possible includes both a kind of sense of what is possible in a certain historical and cultural world. So, for example, fiction that, for example, discusses past worlds, historical fiction, can give us a sense of what a certain historical world was like. So, for example, in my book, I have examples of contemporary fiction that deals with the Second World War and with Nazi Germany, and particularly perpetrator fiction that explores how is it possible that ordinary Germans took part in the Holocaust. So in that way, literature can in kind of experiential way convey a sense of what it was like to live in a certain historical world, and what the people in that world felt was possible for them and what was impossible for them. But another side of this sense of the possible is a sense of how things could be otherwise. So it's also very important to both for imagining different life courses, for example, but also for imagining alternative futures, how the world could be otherwise. So what is presented to us as necessary and inevitable, how it could actually be differently, how it could be otherwise. So if at one end of the continuum is this kind of literature that expands our sense of the possible, then at the other end would be ethically problematic narratives that diminish somehow our sense of the possible. For example, literature that reinforces harmful cultural stereotypes by suggesting that, for example, gender or ethnicity or class prevent automatically makes it impossible for us to do certain things, or the kind of fatalistic beliefs that present lives as predestined to follow a certain inevitable trajectory. So secondly, we can evaluate narrative practices in terms of what they do to our self-understanding, and I mean both personal self-understanding and cultural self-understanding. So arguably, we always already have some kind of implicit narrative understanding of our lives in relation to those of others. For example, one may think of oneself as the kind of person who acts in a certain way in certain social situations. For example, as a devoted mother or a loyal friend or social phobic, and the kind of narratives that come with these ideas influence how we understand ourselves and act in the world. To engage self-reflectively with our implicit narrative self-understandings, and with the cultural narratives that we may be unconsciously reenacting or perpetuating, is to bring to the level of consciousness what would otherwise affect us behind our backs. Gadamer uses this expression. So engagement with literary narratives is an important form of narrative self-reflection, in my view. Gadamer emphasizes that we learn to understand ourselves in and through encountering the other, and works of art such as literary narratives can function in this role of the other. Such encounters can provide us with richer hermeneutic resources for understanding our experiences, responses, fears, and anxieties. From a hermeneutic perspective, the others that we encounter in reading literary texts are not only the characters, for example, characters in a novel with whom we could identify or not identify, but the whole world projected by the literary work. So also the modes of expression, possibilities that these worlds open up. In Metafelski's words, readers' experiences of what she calls recognition can inspire a revised or altered sense of who I am. Something that may have been sensed in a vague, diffuse or semi-conscious way now takes on a distinct shape, is amplified, heightened, or made newly visible. It is clear, however, that not all narratives provide us with ethically valuable tools for self-reflection. Many dominant narratives that circulate in the media and current populist narratives, for example in politics, reinforce ethically problematic stereotypes that often impede both personal and cultural self-understanding. Then this idea of non-subsumptive mode of understanding the other is a difficult word, but I'll explain. I'll try to explain it a bit. So we can evaluate whether narratives enhance or impede our ability to understand others, other lives and other people's experiences in their singular uniqueness. So thinkers like Emmanuel Levinas and Roland Barthes have been traditionally very critical of narrative, and they see narrative to be one important reason why they are so critical of narrative is that they see narrative as an inherently ethically problematic mode of appropriation, kind of mode of violent appropriation that reduces the singularity of experiences to a narrative account that gives these experiences general meanings or explanations, or present them as part of a necessary course of events. While post-structuralist thinkers tend to conceive of all knowledge and understanding in terms of a subsumptive model, according to which understanding always entails subsuming something singular, so something particular singular under a general concept or law or model, the hermeneutic approach suggests that there are different types of understanding and knowledge, and the ethical potential of certain forms of narrative is linked to the possibility of what I call non-subsumptive understanding. This position is based on the hermeneutic conception of the kind of understanding that can occur when we are capable of being open and receptive to the otherness of the other, letting it challenge our preconceptions and our concepts. So it's not knowledge and understanding is not always so that we just assimilate what is in the world to what we already, to our concepts that are already fixed, but also what we encounter can change and challenge our concepts. And that's why there is this possibility of non-subsumptive understanding that transforms us somehow. Hannah Arendt, for example, suggests that while abstract definitions risk reducing the unique who to the what, a narrative in which the who is presented in the temporal process of acting in the world, in concrete, complex situations, in a process of becoming, can give expression to the unique, unexchangeable who revealed in that action. So this Arendtian view is quite diametrically opposed to the Levinasian conception of narrative as violent appropriation. I suggest that it is useful for narrative ethics to distinguish between subsumptive narrative practices, on the one hand, that often reinforce stereotypes or at least somehow subsume singular experiences under culturally dominant narrative schemes, and on the other hand, non-subsumptive narratives or narrative practices that somehow challenge our categories of appropriation and understanding. I will come back to this idea of non-subsumptive understanding in relation to memory a bit later. Okay, then another concept that I have made up is this narrative in between. So narratives can be or can have ethical potential in shaping what I call these narrative in-betweens that hold communities together, that there is intersubjective spaces that somehow link people to each other. So in creating literature, for example, can create new in-betweens that make possible new forms of intersubjectivity. So by this concept of a narrative in-between, I mean these intersubjective spaces that also are in a way moral spaces or ethically charged spaces that affect our ethical narrative identity, so our understanding of who we are as moral agents, what is possible for us, what we're capable of, how we are in relation to other people. So Hannah Arendt develops the idea of that storytelling is a crucial means of creating a shared intersubjective space, what she calls a common world that lies between people and can relate and bind them together, and is no less real than the world of things we visibly have in common. It seems to me, however, that Arendt's followers have not always paid heed to how this Arendtian common world, like she writes, that like every in-between relates and separates men at the same time. So in evaluating how narratives shape our narrative in-betweens, one important continuum on which narratives can be placed is a continuum from inclusive to exclusive narrative in-betweens, because narratives are also, because they can either try to create a solidarity and include more people within this shared space, or they can deliberately exclude and create this others who are not included. So, for example, Trump's narrative of making America great again is a narrative that excludes and marginalizes many minorities, such as immigrants, despite the significant role that they have played historically in constituting the American nation. Literary and other cultural narratives are modes of shaping and transforming narrative in-betweens, and thereby they can also take part in negotiating the discourses of us and others. This can take many different forms. For example, they can create new forms of solidarity and inclusion by providing us with shared vocabularies for articulating and dealing with experiences that have been ill understood or marginalized. And Rita Felsky writes about the flash of connection that leaps across the gap between the text and the reader. As an affinity or attunement is brought to life. For example, we can identify, when we read literature, we can identify with characters with whom we would not necessarily identify with in real life. So we can identify across gender and class and ethnicity, for example. And the transformative potential of narratives is inextricably linked to the formative dimension. So in shaping intersubjective reality, narratives can transform and expand the possibilities of intersubjectivity that are open for us, such as different forms of solidarity and being in relationship with others. Okay, and then the fifth continuum concerns perspective awareness. So we can evaluate whether narratives cultivate or impede our perspective awareness. It is currently perhaps the most popular argument for the ethical value of narrative fiction, that it allegedly it cultivates our capacity for empathy. This is a very common argument that many, not only philosophers but also cognitive scientists make nowadays. It is traditionally kind of Nussbaumian argument. So Martin Nussbaum is an influential philosopher who has argued this already for many decades. But also recent empirical research in the psychology of reading, some studies have found support for the view that fictional narratives are more efficient than non-fiction in helping us imagine the perspective of the other. For example, the study by Kidd and Castano, it has been quite widely reported, and they argue that the affective and cognitive skills involved in understanding that others have beliefs, desires and intentions that are different from one's own are improved after reading literary fiction compared to reading non-fiction or popular fiction or nothing at all. They suggest that in addition to temporary enhancement of these skills, long-term effects could also be achieved by regular engagement with literature. But in my view, it's far from evident how such long-term effects could be measured in reliable ways, because the effect of literature on us is so complex. It seems much more convincing to me to argue that literature increases our ability to perceive the world from multiple perspectives, or that at least it increases our awareness of this multiplicity. So at least our awareness of how there are always different perspectives to everything. There's never only one perspective or one story. There are always different versions of the same story. So I think it's more convincing to me to argue that it increases our perspective awareness than to argue that it makes us somehow more ethical in the sense of making us engage in moral action. Because there is always a leap from the ability to imagine the perspectives of others and from hypothetical statements of what I would do in an imaginative situation, than a leap from that to actually carrying on concrete actions in the real world. But I think the narrative imagination or perspective awareness or perspective sensitivity could be still, or I think it is ethically relevant, and it could even be like a necessary condition for ethical agency to some extent, even if it is not a sufficient condition. So it doesn't guarantee anything. But it could like facilitate dialogue. And then the final continuum concerns the possibility of ethical inquiry. So we can ethically evaluate narratives by analyzing whether they function as a form of ethical inquiry or more as a form of dogmatism. So most approaches to literary narrative ethics seem to rely on the often tacit assumption that we somehow basically already know what is right and wrong, and that narrative fiction teaches us some kinds of moral truths, that it's some form of moral instruction, like Wayne Booth and Nussbaum argue, or that it helps us cultivate our ethical decision-making abilities by providing us with exercises in applying abstract moral maxims to practice. So, for example, Noel Carroll is a philosopher who has this, what he calls cultivation approach. So it links this approach links the ethical value of narrative fiction to the cultivation of our powers of moral deliberation by arguing that such exercise enhances our ability to reflect on further moral situations, just as running through logic exercises prepares us to solve moral theorems we have never seen before. I consider it important to acknowledge, however, that instead of teaching moral values or rehearsing our powers of moral deliberation, narrative itself, and particularly literary narratives, can function as a form of ethical inquiry in its own right. So often its ethical potential lies more in the questions that it poses than in the answers it proposes. Perhaps the most important contribution of narrative fiction to ethical imagination takes place when the application of knowledge that we already have is precisely not enough. When we become aware of the limits of our ethical imagination, when we engage with completely new perspectives on some of our most fundamental ethical questions concerning how to live our lives together with others, for example, that's when we can find new ways of asking these questions, and at the most radical, even new ways of understanding the very meaning of the ethical. So if that would be like the sort of ethically most radical kind of literary fiction, then at the opposite and ethically problematic end of the continuum would be the kind of narratives that precisely don't present themselves as narratives but as the absolute truth, as the only possible way of thinking, and which thereby reinforce dogmatism. Narratives that diminish our possibilities and shut down discussion by declaring or implying that there is only one right model of the good life or just society, of being in relationship or organizing social life or so on. Okay, so those were the continuums. And I will now move on a bit away from the book to some of my new projects that I have just started. So this is very tentative, but also in this, I just very briefly present two new projects, and I also hope to somehow make use of this model in them in some way. So there are some links, but also attempts to go in new directions. So first of all, I have this project on meta-narrativity, and it's part of this larger consortium that I have with colleagues from Finland. So its consortium is called Instrumental Narratives, the Limits of Storytelling and New Story Critical Narrative Theory. It's funded by Academy of Finland, and it's a 4-year project. And there are 3 teams, so I'm the principal investigator of the Turku team, and then there are teams, Maria Mäkelä's team at Tampere and Merja Polvinen's team at Helsinki, and also a lot of international collaborators. And the idea of this larger project, this consortium, is to look at the different uses, instrumental uses of narratives in society, in contemporary society, particularly problematic uses, how narratives are used to manipulate us in various ways. And so there is a kind of story critical dimension to this project. But what I'm particularly interested in, and what we are doing in this Turku part of the team, is that we will look at how actually also narrative fiction provides us critical perspectives on how narratives are used in contemporary society to manipulate us and influence us. So fiction can also be story critical in some sense, in this sense. And then we also look at current debates on cultural well-being, how that concept is understood often in quite narrow sense, and we critically engage with that narrow understanding of cultural well-being. So with the concept of meta-narrativity, I use it in a quite different sense than you might be familiar with. I mean self-reflexive storytelling practices that make narrative their theme, that somehow thematize the issue of narratives by reflecting on the significance and different functions of narratives in our lives. So, in earlier discussions, meta-narrativity or the concept of meta-narrative have been used in two very different senses. So, you have probably heard of Lyotard's use of, I think he uses more the concept of grand narratives, like grand récit, but he also uses meta-récit. And that's often translated in English as meta-narrative. But I think it's kind of narrative, master narrative is a kind of narrative that seeks to offer legitimation through some kind of anticipated completion of a master idea, such as enlightenment or socialist utopia. But I think it's quite misleading to translate this idea of master narrative as meta-narrative, because the prefix meta suggests that they are narratives about narratives somehow, whereas these master narratives precisely mask and hide their own narrativity, so they don't present themselves as narratives, but as the truth, basically. And then another use of meta-narrativity is in narratology, where meta-narrative narration or meta-narrative refers to self-reflexive narration in which narrators reflect on their own process of narration. But these discussions neglect the kind of ethical and political and existential significance of thematizing the issue of significance of narrative. So it's only a kind of technical term that refers to this kind of self-reflexive narration. So it's not only that the narratives signal that they are narratives, but also they actually can contribute to our understanding of how narratives work in the current world. So, so I'm interested in how meta-narrative narratives reflect on the as I said, significance and functions of narratives in our lives. And in relation to these key features, I'm particularly interested in the issue of narrative agency. So how this kind of fiction could somehow amplify our narrative agency, our capacity to engage critically with the narratives that surround us, so that we don't just perpetuate the culturally available narratives, but have a more somehow more critically engaged relationship to those narratives, and maybe also able to imagine different ways of narrating and living our lives, and the obvious narrative identities that are offered to us. Okay, but that was very brief about that. But then this memory thing, because Brian mentioned that you have a class on memory, and it would be good to say something about that. So I will now, at the last part of this talk, I will move on to the sort of memory studies and contact between narrative studies and memory studies. That's also one of my kind of long-term interests, how narrative and memory intersect, and that's also a key focus of this research at Selma that I have in Turku. So, memory plays a crucial role in our sense-making processes, in our ways of orienting ourselves in the world as individuals and communities. We always encounter a new situation from a horizon of understanding that is shaped by our early experiences and by the social and cultural webs of meaning in which we are entangled. Cultural and social practices of memory affect how things are perceived in the public, how they are talked about, how they are narrated and understood. When memory has been traditionally seen, especially in the kind of psychological sense, it has been seen as a process of retrieving aspects of the past, recent memory studies have increasingly emphasized the dynamic, productive and performative nature of memory. And that's also something that Jens and Brian and AUP have been contributing to. So remembering is an activity, something that we do in the present. It makes something present for particular purposes and thereby takes part in shaping current cultural and social reality. We remember what is socially relevant for us and what the culturally available memorial forms steer us to remember. Nevertheless, relatively scarce explicit attention has been devoted to the complex socially mediated relationship between memory and understanding. In such an endeavor, it is crucial to acknowledge that practices of memory as resources for understanding are shaped by social and cultural narrative sense-making models, and that they have ethical and political implications. An ethically crucial question is how to evaluate when memory or memory practices contribute to genuine and ethically sustainable understanding of others, and when they prevent it or function as a violent form of appropriating the other. So in ethically evaluating the ethical and political potential of memory for the present and future, it is useful to look at how practices of memory as processes of sense-making can be placed on the continuum from subsumptive to non-subsumptive practices of memory. So I'm not in this project, I'm trying to see if this idea could be also applied not only to narrative but also to memory. So depending on whether memory practices foster subsumptive or non-subsumptive understanding. So when we use narratives of our past experiences as models of sense-making to which we relate new experiences, we can do this in very different ways. Memory follows the logic of subsumption when it is reified into a fixed memorial form or template under which new events and experiences are subsumed. For example, a particular phenomenon, an experience or event, can be subsumed under a narrative sense-making model that is based on past experiences, so that it is taken to be the same as something of which we have a memory or with which we are familiar through cultural narratives. For example, I often have these examples from Nazi Germany for some reason, but again, so Nazi Germany or East Germany, for example, can function as such sense-making models when developments in Trump's America are compared to the rise of fascism in the 1930s Europe, or when the surveillance of dissidents in contemporary Turkey or Hungary are compared to Stasi terror. As Michael Rothberg puts it, comparison is unavoidable because we cannot not attempt to understand our local situation, whatever it is, without reference to global historical developments in a variety of other national contexts. But sometimes historical events become models of sense-making that are used as fixed templates in order to make sense of, in this kind of subsumptive, problematic way of other historical phenomena without being attentive to their historical specificity. In contrast, memory serves understanding in a non-subsumptive mode when we use our earlier experiences and understandings as a starting point for understanding something new, but without thereby subsuming the new under what we remember and understand from our past experiences, so at least not so straightforwardly. So non-subsumptive memory has ethical potential when it is dialogical, when it is used as a resource for learning and is characterized by willingness to nuance the meaning of past events in the light of what we know now. Such non-subsumptive memory is open to both directions in a way, concerning our understanding of current events and our understanding of the past. However, there can be no purely subsumptive or non-subsumptive memory, and in practice, processes of memory combine subsumptive and non-subsumptive elements in different ways. The meaning of the Holocaust of East Germany, for example, is shaped by narratives and images that circulate in different media. Instead of having merely one general meaning that everyone shares, there are sites of contestation, negotiation, and debate in which different memory practices participate. In the process of negotiating contested memory, attempts at subsumption can be challenged and be interpreted in non-subsumptive ways. I will now try to illustrate this a bit with this example, literary example, a novel by Jenny Ervenbeck. So her novel Gehen, gegangen, going, gone is a narrative about a retired German professor of classics, Richard, who has an East German past, and in the narrative present slowly gets to know African refugees who are looking for asylum in Berlin. The novel presents narrative and memory as interlaced modes of sense-making that are integral to our attempts to orient ourselves in the world. So the protagonist asks, they find their way by these stories. Yes. They find it by remembering. Yes. In thematizing the intimate link between narrative and memory, it shows how we remember what we receive in narratives, how narratives shape our processes of remembrance and produce reality by selecting certain things as worth remembering and by neglecting others, and how the stories we have been raised on become part of us almost as if we personally remembered the recounted events. For Richard, such a formative memory is a story of how he was as a toddler in the aftermath of the Second World War, almost left behind on the train platform. But at the last moment, just before the train left, a Russian soldier lifted him up and handed him through the train's window to his mother. This was a story his mother told him so many times that eventually it seemed to him he remembered it himself. For Richard, both the cultural memory of the Holocaust and the both personal and cultural memory of East Germany function as memorial forms or memorial templates that he uses in the attempt to relate to the situation of the refugees and to make sense of how the Germans deal with the refugee crisis. So these templates both enable understanding, but they also, at other times, they also prevent it. In distinguishing between productive and problematic processes of memory, it is crucial whether the use of memorial forms functions substantively or non-substantively. In trying to engage with the refugees' experiences of exile, his East German past both helps him to see certain things, but it also blinds him to other things. So the narrator repeatedly draws attention to what the protagonist does not perceive and does not see. For example, he does not hear the silence on Alexanderplatz, despite the magnitude of the silence produced by the asylum seekers who refuse to say their name. So they have this kind of demonstration where they refuse to say their name to identify themselves. So I read the quotation. The silence of these men who would rather die than reveal their identity unites with the waiting of all these others who want their questions answered to produce a great silence in the middle of the square called Alexanderplatz in Berlin. Why is it that Richard, walking past all these black and white people sitting and standing that afternoon, doesn't hear this silence? He's thinking of Rezov. I'm not sure how to pronounce it. Richard's archaeologist friend had told him about the system of cellars under the town hall of Alexanderplatz, and he relates that to the Polish city of Rezov, which also has a labyrinth of subterranean tunnels. Jews hid in both of these tunnels during the Nazi years. Just like Rezov, he thinks. This act of subsumption, which involves seeing a sameness between these two events, stops him from seeing what is actually going on in the square, right there out in the open, in plain sight. It is often the moment when Richard thinks that he understands, when he takes this or that to be exactly the same as something that he knows from some other context, that he is led astray. In contrast, it is the humility linked to admitting his ignorance and the curiosity of wanting to know more that lead him to actually understanding something new. In these productive instances of understanding, however, he also draws on his past, particularly on those aspects of his life that involved an experience of being lost, disoriented, or estranged from his own life, an experience of becoming a stranger, not only to others but also to himself. So, in 1990, he suddenly found himself a citizen of a different country from one day to the next, though the view out of the window remained the same. So, because the time of the fall of the war. And a similar experience of disruption is crucial to the life stories of the refugees in different ways, but this is kind of repeated theme in the novel. From one day to the next, our former life came to an end. So there are a lot of different refugees or asylum seekers speaking in the novel, and several of them say similar things like this. Our life was cut off from us that night, as if with a knife. So a key question that the novel explores is how to find shared points of reference without subsuming the other under one's own expectations. One necessarily has a certain pre-understanding, but what is crucial is how one is able to revise it. What the novel does, in turn, what the novel does is turn the emphasis onto everything that Richard brings to the encounter with the other, instead of pretending that he has full access to the other. So it focuses very much on the conditions of possibility of genuine encounter, in which something ethically valuable can happen. So on the conditions of possibility of a dialogical encounter, in which one's presuppositions become challenged and categories of understanding transformed. Awareness of social and cultural differences and of the uneven distribution of power often help Richard to counteract the subsumptive impulse and opens the way for non-subsumptive engagement with the other, based on curiosity and wonder rather than on appropriative playing to feel what the other feels. But ultimately, just as important is as a sense of this uniqueness and difference of everyone's life stories is a sense of a shared humanity. So Richard asserts that how we now treat the refugees is the real test of whether Hitler won in the end or not. Only if they survived Germany now would Hitler truly have lost the war. So the novel asks, are we now able to count everyone in the sphere of humanity, or do we still differentiate between those who merit to be treated as fully human and those who are second-class humans with no basic human rights? The novel as a whole puts the emphasis on the question-like, explorative mode of memory and narrative. It presents a desire for narrative mastery in a tensional relationship to what eludes narrative understanding. Richard looks for a narrative that would help him understand what it means to be a refugee, to investigate how one makes the transition from a full, readily comprehensible existence to the life of a refugee, which is open in all directions, drafty as it were. He has to know what was at the beginning, what was in the middle, and what is now. In fact, the novel contains a meta-narrative and story-critical dimension in showing, well, first of all, by exploring this, the problematic dimension of this kind of desire for narrative mastery, and also by showing that that which cannot be told in the Western social economy of storytelling cannot be remembered either. There are journalists and reporters who are interested in these demonstrations and the kind of tension that's building up around these asylum seekers. And the reporter asserts, if nothing special happens, I can't make a story out of it. The everyday slow processes in society cannot be easily narrated. The kind of structural violence of society does not make great stories. And this is why the structural violence of society tends to be made invisible. If the refugees jump off the roof of a high building, this is something that they plan and they realize that would make that would get them media coverage. So if the refugees jump off the roof of a high building, it is more scandalous in the view of the public than the fact that the state lets them slowly expire under miserable conditions, as only first makes an easily tellable and sellable story. At first, Richard finds it exhausting to engage with the life stories of the refugees, but from the refugees' point of view, their stories are so overwhelming and contain so much pain that it is not easy for them to enter into what the world is ready to receive as a narrative. They ask themselves how to find one's way into the world of all that can be told. Their sense of what can be narrated is intimately linked to their sense of the possible, what is possible and impossible for them in their position as refugees or asylum seekers. Overall, Epimec contributes to a form of cultural memory in which both a sense of shared humanity and a sense of the singularity of each individual life is simultaneously present. The novel suggests that we should draw on our experiences of foreignness, marginalization, neglect, and violence to keep ourselves emotionally open and alive to the suffering of others, but at the same time we should accept that we can never fully understand another human being, and all we can do is try to learn from one another through curiosity, empathy, and compassion. The whole novel is, in a way, also through its narrative form, which I didn't have time to analyze here so much now, but it is very much an exploration that is shot through with humility and modesty. It invites thinking of memory as a resource for asking questions rather than as a container of answers. This is a challenge that might be worth taking up in current memory studies in order to develop the idea of a future-oriented memory that functions as a resource for learning and asking productive questions that help us engage with others in non-appropriative, ethically sustainable ways. And also, in conclusion, I want to emphasize that crucial to this approach to both narrative and memory is that narrative form in itself does not make narratives ethical or unethical in themselves. It is important to acknowledge both how narratives can reinforce oppressive social structures and their potential to enlarge the space of possibilities in which we can act, think, and reimagine the world together with others. I hope my analysis of Epimec illustrated this at least a little bit. So the novel addresses many problematic uses of narrative, but at the same time the novel as a whole can be seen to expand our sense of the possible by giving us a sense of what the refugees' space of experience might be like and what points of contact we might imagine with that space. It thereby participates in building a shared narrative space, a narrative in between groups that are often portrayed as opposite to one another, as us and them. And by presenting us with a multitude of different perspectives of asylum seekers, with each one that has their own individual unique story, it expands our perspective awareness and cultivates our perspective sensitivity. Thereby the novel illustrates what I take to be key aspects of the ethical potential of literary narratives. But ultimately, whether that potential is actualized or not depends on what happens in the encounter between the text and the reader. Thank you.